I'm going to talk about options for cutting income tax and national insurance contributions. Now, given what we've heard this morning on public finances, it might seem odd that I'm talking about cutting taxes rather than raising them. But in the Conservative leadership election, the new Prime Minister indicated a clear desire to cut direct personal taxes, both by raising the point at which the higher rate of income tax is paid from £50,000 a year to £80,000 a year, and by raising the point at which people start paying national insurance contributions on earnings in order to help low earners. Our new Chancellor has also expressed a desire to cut taxes, being a low tax kind of guy. And so, given the likely direction of travel under this current government, we've looked at the effects of the Prime Minister's proposed policies and also considered other ways of cutting taxes for high-income individuals and for supporting low earners. I'll start by giving a little bit of background to these tax cuts. So, as we heard from Stuart, tax take in the UK is at historically high levels. It's been rising over the last 30-odd years. But if we just look at direct personal taxes, that is, income tax and national insurance contributions, we see that revenues from these taxes haven't risen in the past few decades, and indeed we're still substantially below the levels in the mid-1970s. As Stuart said, taxes in the UK are relatively low by international standards, but what I wanted to emphasize here was that this can be fully explained by lower revenues from direct personal taxes. So if we look at revenues from all other taxes combined, so that's the dark green part of the bars there, we see that the UK raises similar levels to other developed countries, and indeed above the OECD average. So what this means is that large cuts to direct personal taxes of the sort proposed by the Prime Minister would take revenues from direct personal taxes to historically low levels in the UK, and also make the UK more atypical among developed countries. So I'll start by talking about the policy to increase the high rate threshold, and then move on to the next policy. This chart shows the marginal tax schedule for income tax and national insurance contributions. So it shows for every level of income, the tax rate faced on each additional pound of income. Income tax is devolved to Scotland, and national insurance rates vary depending on whether you're self-employed or an employee, whether you're working age or above the state pension age. So to be precise, what I'm showing here is the schedule for working age employees in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. I'm also simplifying by assuming that the only source of income is earnings. The different kinks on the schedule show the various thresholds for national insurance contributions and income tax. So for example, at earnings of £8,632 a year, you start paying national insurance contributions on earnings. The basic rate of income tax kicks in at £12,500 a year. And at £50,000 a year, you start paying the higher rate of income tax, but this is partly offset by a lower rate of NICs above this point. At incomes of £100,000 a year, you get this funny jump in the marginal tax schedule, and this is due to the personal allowance being withdrawn by £1 for every additional £2 above this point. So what this effectively does is it creates a 62% marginal tax band at incomes of between £100,000 a year and £125,000 a year. At this point, the marginal tax rate falls back to 42%, before rising again to 47% when the additional rate of income tax kicks in. So all in all, quite a complicated schedule, probably not what we designed if we were to start from scratch. So what's the Prime Minister proposing? Well, the proposal is to raise the point at which the high rate of income tax and the corresponding lower rate of NICs kicks in from £50,000 a year to £80,000 a year. We estimate that this would cost about £9 billion a year if implemented in the next fiscal year. The Prime Minister's indicated that he might want to raise the high rate threshold more gradually, and this would cost less in the long run because the target of £80,000 is fixed, but the higher rate threshold is set to increase with inflation even under current policy. So for example, in 5 years' time, the higher rate threshold under current policy is set to rise to just over £54,000 a year, which means that the jump to 80,000 would then be smaller. That said, it's still quite a large jump, and we estimate that even if the policy weren't fully in place until 2024, it would still cost £8 billion a year in the long run. The policy benefits everyone with incomes of over £50,000 a year, So that's roughly 3.7 million individuals, or the highest income 8% of adults. Now, it's worth noting that the very highest income individuals have seen a number of tax increases over the past 10 years or so. For example, with the introduction of the additional rate and the personal allowance taper in 2010. So you can think of this policy as partly offsetting those tax increases that they've seen. That said, the policy also benefits high-income individuals with slightly lower incomes who haven't seen their taxes increase in recent years. I've said that 3.7 million individuals benefit directly from the policy, but many more people would benefit indirectly by living in a household in which someone gains. And since the policy benefits the highest income individuals, it's also not surprising that it mostly benefits the highest income households. That said, people's incomes change substantially over their lifetimes, so some people who don't earn enough to benefit from the policy today might earn enough at some point in the future to benefit from the policy. And we estimate that around 1 in 4 people is likely to, at some point in their lives, benefit from the policy if it were to remain in place. One rationale the Prime Minister's given for raising the high rate threshold is to help people who've been dragged into paying higher rates of income tax through fiscal drag. That is, because the higher rate threshold hasn't increased in line with earnings. And we see in this chart here that the share of higher and additional rate taxpayers has indeed increased substantially over time, from just under 4% in 1990 to just under 8% today. However, raising the higher rate threshold to £80,000 would more than undo this rise. It would take 2.5 million people out of paying high rate tax and take the share of high rate taxpayers to just under 3%, the lowest level since the individual tax system began in 1990. So what we've seen is a very large tax cut that mostly benefits high-income individuals. Now, let's set aside for a moment the merits of such a policy and take for granted the Prime Minister's desire to cut taxes for those in high incomes. Looking at this marginal tax schedule, we think that if the Prime Minister were to do so, he could take the opportunity to rationalise the tax system at the same time. So again, looking at the spike, an obvious thing to do here is to remove the personal allowance taper, which creates this arbitrary and opaque spike in marginal tax rates. Just removing the personal allowance taper would be an even bigger giveaway to some very high-income individuals, but we could recoup some of that cost by slightly raising the high rate of income tax from the current 40p to 45p. This alternative policy would maintain the tax giveaway to people with incomes of more than £50,000, as the Prime Minister clearly intends, whilst also rationalising our tax system and bringing us back to a simpler income tax system with only 2 income tax rates. So I'll now move on to talking about the second policy of raising the NICS threshold. To give a bit of context to this policy, it used to be the case that you'd start paying national insurance contributions at about the same time you start paying income tax. So as this chart shows, for most of the 2000s, the starting threshold for paying NICS was broadly in line with the personal allowance for income tax. However, since the late 2000s, successive governments have increased the personal allowance in real terms without paying much attention to NICS, so that now we have about a £4,000 gap between these 2 thresholds. What this means is that someone working on the national living wage could work 26 hours a week without paying any income tax, but could only work 21 hours a week before they have to start paying NICS. So let's give credit where credit is due. It's welcome that the Prime Minister is focusing on the NICS threshold rather than, say, proposing yet another increase in the personal allowance. The Prime Minister hasn't indicated how much he plans to raise the NICS threshold by, or which NICS thresholds he plans to raise, which makes evaluating the effect of the policy quite difficult. But we estimate that for every £1,000 by which the NICS threshold is raised, this would cost at least £3 billion a year, or £5 billion a year if the point at which employers start paying NICS is raised along with the point at which individuals start paying NICS. Perhaps the most generous variant of the policy would be to align the NICS threshold with the personal allowance, as was the case in the early 2000s. And doing this would cost £10 billion a year, or £17 billion a year if the employer threshold were raised as well. The Prime Minister has said that the aim of this policy is to help low-earning families, who he said were his priority. And the new Chancellor has also said that when it comes to tax cuts, we should always be thinking about low-earning families first. But as this chart shows, the policy of raising the NICS threshold actually benefits working households on higher incomes more than it benefits working households on lower incomes. And note here that I'm just showing the distribution for working households because changes in NICS won't affect households in which no one's in work. So there's a number of reasons for this pattern that we see here. One is that many of the poorest households simply don't earn enough to pay NICS in the first place. So of the poorest 10% of working households, just under half pay NICS under the current system. A second reason is that many of the poorest households receive some income from benefits, some of which are assessed on post-tax incomes. And this means that some of their gains from a cut in NICS would then be recouped through lower benefit payments. A third obvious point is that whilst raising the NICS threshold helps some low earners, just not the very lowest earners, it also helps higher earners at least as much, and so it's a very poorly targeted way to help low-earning families. And indeed, we estimate that for every pound spent raising the NICS threshold, only about 8p would reach the poorest 20% of working households. And when you look at all households, not just working households, this figure is just 3p in every pound. So what might a government do instead to put more money in the pockets of low-earning families? Well, one alternative is to work through the in-work benefit system rather than the tax system, which by definition targets support at relatively low-income families. And you can think of, instead of raising NICS threshold, a policy of raising work allowances and universal credit, which is how much you can earn before your benefits start being withdrawn. The level of work allowances vary depending on your family circumstances and whether you claim support for housing costs, but for most groups, work allowances today are considerably lower in real terms than they were in 2012, than their planned levels in 2012, which is when the first finalized work allowances were announced. And just as an illustrative example, for £3 billion a year, which is the cost of raising the NICS threshold by £1,000, we could restore work allowances to at least their 2012 planned levels for all groups, and then further increase work allowances by 20%. Now, of course, we recognize that increasing means-tested benefits is different from cutting taxes, and it does come with its own drawbacks. So, for example, people might perceive some sort of stigma in claiming benefits and therefore not claim all the benefits they're entitled to. It would bring more people into the benefit system, which could then increase administration costs. And whilst increasing work allowances would have positive effects on work incentives at the very bottom of the distribution, it would have more mixed effects further up the income distribution. But if we just look at the distributional effects of this policy, we see that raising work allowances and universal credit would target low-income families far better than the corresponding NICS cut. The households in the bottom decile of working households would gain around 15 times as much. And instead of just 8p in every pound reaching the poorest 20% of working households, 65p in every pound from raising work allowances would reach these households. So to bring it all together, the policies proposed by the Prime Minister represent a substantial cut to direct personal taxes. This is in the order of magnitude of the 1% fiscal loosening that Isabel and Citi talked about earlier. But it's worth noting here that what's being proposed is a permanent cut to taxes and not a temporary fiscal Brexit-related stimulus. Both the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have said that they would prioritise low-earning families when it comes to cutting taxes. But as we've seen, both of these policies would actually benefit high-income households more than they would benefit low-income households. And we think that in both these cases, there are alternative, potentially better policies to achieve the intended aims of the Prime Minister than the policies he's proposed. So, for example, if the government were to cut taxes for high-income individuals, it could take that opportunity to remove the personal allowance taper and rationalise our tax system at the same time. And if the government wants to target low-earning families, it could do so much more effectively through raising work allowances and universal credit, rather than by raising the NICS threshold. So that's it from me. I'll now hand over to Rebecca, who'll talk about motoring taxes.